Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Platonists. And today I have a very special guest. I'm excited to be talking to Odysseus,
Greetings.
who owns the channel Logos and Dharma on Telegram, and really talks a lot about the convergence between things like Neoplatonism and Theurgy and the Buddhist tradition. So excited to talk to him a lot about that, about both Platonism and Buddhism and the intersection of that. A lot of you guys probably know that I myself used to be a Buddhist, so I've got some experience there, and I'm excited to see kind of where these things converge in a lot of ways. I think today, more than ever, we're seeing a lot of Platonists who are also very interested in Buddhism. So this isn't anything necessarily new, but I think you're really at the forefront of talking about that and really diving deep into where those connections are. So I think maybe to kick it off, if you could introduce yourself, just let everybody know kind of who you are. That would be great.
Thank you, Eric, for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here and to talk with a fellow Platonist with a Buddhist background. So, my name is Odysseus Bournias Varotsis. I had an interest in consciousness ever since I can remember myself. Obviously, when I was younger, that interest would have been more intuitive. And that interest grew over the years and eventually led me to studies in mindfulness, which I hold a master's degree in that. And also, it led me to connect with initiatic transmissions of various lineages. Specifically, I like to think of myself as a practitioner of Platonic Buddhism, which might sound like an oxymoron term, but that's just one way to put it, although I do not grasp at this definition of my spiritual practice. And I have a special interest, particularly in the practice of Tantra in its various forms, both Buddhist and non Buddhist, and of course, Neoplatonic Theurgy. Other than that, as you said, I do have public work which I post on Telegram and Substack. Recently, I also had my start off of my YouTube channel with the name Logos and Dharma. And the most exciting project for me, to be honest with you, is not my public writings or whatever video I might publish, is a project of intentional community, which is emerging right now in Greece, Peloponnese, named Politia Mandala. And it is a community of people which we have as a basis the Platonic political ethos, social and ethical and philosophical. And we want to conjoin this with spiritual contemplative practices of non-dualism, mostly Buddhism, but we're also open to many other traditions which seem to go into the core essence of consciousness and being.
That's great. Yeah, I love to hear that. So you yourself are you reside in Greece most of the time?
Exactly.
Great, great. Uh, I remember really curious about this intentional community. That's something that at Platonic Path is something that we've been working on as well, is kind of creating these intentional Platonic communities and organizing ourselves around those. And I'm curious kind of how you come to that. So both in the sense of, you're talking about a Platonic, sort of that idea of the Platonic polity. I guess could you explain kind of what that means?
Platonic polity. That's a difficult subject to unfold, but I would say that the Platonic polity is about manifesting justice, Platonic justice, in a civic form. And what is Platonic justice? It is that every thing and every entity, both human and non-human, have its own proper place in the ontological sense in an ordered structure which is harmonious. So in Platonism, there is this general principle that there is unity in difference and difference in unity. And whether we create suffering for ourselves and others and for our world It has to do whether we tune in, we align those differences and the principle of unity in a harmonious way or not. And in order for harmony to manifest in difference, we need justice. We need to be aware who we are, how we relate to others, and how these relations can manifest beauty. So when it comes to the Platonic polity, is taking those principles, these philosophical principles, and getting inspired by the works of Plato in his Republic, the Laws, and not obviously implementing what he wrote letter to letter. That's an impossibility. But learning to understand, to rethink how communal life between humans can be from the Platonic perspective, which is pre-modern. So there is a release from the modern categories. You know, there's this craziness with identity politics, and even before that, going back to the French Revolution, I do find that those political categories are innately insufficient in the sense that it creates strife, first and foremost inwards, and then obviously in the outer world as well. So there is this movement, not only with me and our community, obviously this is a wider counterculture movement, both in the both spectrums of politics, where there is a radical rethinking of what we're doing in our social life, in our economical systems, in our politics. And in that discussion, in my opinion, it does not really matter whether you think of yourself as conservative, as a progressive, as a theist, as an atheist, as a Christian or a pagan or whatever. Plato has a lot to give.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I do think, you know, the modern categories, like you said, of maybe the Enlightenment liberalism, you know, in the general sense of philosophical liberalism, do seem to be decaying at the moment. This idea that, you know, it's all about the individual and the individual's wants and needs, and sort of liberating them from any bonds that they may have, whether that be religion or their nation, their people, even their family to some extent. And I do see what you mean. Like at the core of Plato is this idea that we're tied back to this divine order. And that's sort of our ultimate goal, is to find our seat, our place within that divine order as best as possible. Although that does cut against the modern ethos, right? Quite a bit.
Well, I think it's different. Not exactly cuts against, in the sense that whatever is whole and perfect, it has no contradiction. It does not go against something else. It's not reactionary. I don't think Platonism, perhaps you disagree, but I don't think that Platonism is reactionary to something. I think when it comes to the divine order that you said, yes, but it can be misattributed by someone who is not too familiar with Platonism, that Plato spoke about, you know, a different world, a suprasensible world that is not intimately connected and present right now in the immediacy of the present moment. And thus there is this dualism. I suppose you've heard it many times. Many critics of Plato speak of this, that he was supposedly a dualist, and also Martin Heidegger had the position that everything wrong in the West began with Plato, because we've forgotten being, thinking about the forms and all that. So I think it's important to state and remind the audience that perhaps have not read the dialogues themselves, or they have been influenced by commentators who have their own agenda, their own views, that there's no reason to believe that Plato thought of the divine order as something of an otherworldly world. Like the forms is what makes everything intelligible. They are the conditions that make this present moment intelligible. There is a sound with an information, and there is a receiver of that information that creates a structure of language, a synthesis of vowels and consonants that makes sense to you. And in that manner, we do experience the forms right now. So they are the conditions of intelligibility and the powers of unity of the universe as we see it. And why do I mention this? I mention this because the divine order of Plato is relevant even to someone who might think of himself as a materialist. Because if you get down to it, to what matter is, you find that divine order that Plato was speaking about, and it's not a divine order of some kind of, I don't know, paradise that you get to experience only after death in that sense. And that's why I think Plato can speak to both materialists and non-materialists, both theists and atheists. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
No, that I think that does make sense. I don't think Platonism is confined necessarily to a particular, like only a theist is going to get value out of Plato. And to your point, there's those people who would maybe consider themselves like mathematical Platonists, and they're probably naturalists for the most part, but they do recognize that there is this sort of formal reality that's there. And I definitely see there's a broader reach to Platonism beyond one narrow subset or something that might be sort of theistic Platonism. So yeah, I definitely see what you mean there. And I think that's a great call out, yeah, too, about the forms, that the forms are not this, like, we've kind of adopted this two worlds theory of the forms sometimes, where it's our world and then the perfect world of the forms that's some ethereal realm. And the reality is, like you said, those are interpenetrated with another. They're not these two separate dualistic kind of worlds. We're in it. We're right in the middle of all of that.
Yes, because henology, enologia in Greek, is the Hellenic way to say non-dualism. The one is not the numerical one, obviously, it's the condition for numbers. And because the Hellenes did not really know how to call the first principle in a way that makes sense, they just said, okay, it's not many. And how will we call something that it is not many? We will call it the one. But that's just non-dualism. And perhaps for modern audience that gets carried away with the word the one, thinking of, oh, we're dealing here with some kind of singular monistic view of the ultimate as an ultimate entity comprised by the wholeness of the universe and consciousness and so on. It's not that.
Yeah.
And
I
therefore,
wanted to,
like my point was that when he talks about the forms, we need to understand them non-dually.
mhm. Yeah. That brings up a question I wanted to ask you about this, as the how you see Platonism and Buddhism working together. In Zen Buddhism, there's this idea of nothingness, where you kind of have the absolute, you could say, is this state of nothingness. Do you see that idea as being analogous to the one in Platonism, or do you think that that's something different?
Well, I'm not too familiar with the theoretical aspect of Zen Buddhism to speak about in a comparative way whether the nothingness of Zen Buddhism is close to the one of Platonism. But I will say that when it comes to emptiness, I do believe Kora, the notion of Kora, is the ontological equivalent of emptiness in Platonism. So in Buddhism, most traditions there are either non-metaphysical or quasi-ontological. Generally speaking, Buddhism does not really want to deal too much with ontology or even at all.
Hmm.
So they do not ontologize emptiness, most traditions. Some do though. But because Platonism deals with knowledge, it deals with ontology, and how ontology relates to epistemology, I think the notion of Kora, which is beyond any predication, and Plato, it seems that he gains access to that knowledge through some kind of a vision. He calls it bastard logic, but I think it's one way to describe that he had an inside experience. This is my opinion. It's basically emptiness in ontology. So if Zen Buddhism speaks about nothingness in that manner as the place that recedes for a thing to appear, then I do believe they have many things to say between them, between those two traditions. I wouldn't say though that nothingness is the one precisely. I would say nothingness is what is the purification for us to realize the one, to gain immediate insight into the one. Perhaps that's one way to put it.
No, I think that's good. I think that's a good sort of reservation on it, that we don't just immediately associate something that I know, I guess we're saying this isn't ontological, but we don't want to place an ontology, I guess, on top of the one and give it a particular characteristic or something like that. That makes sense. I'm curious too on the forms, though. Do you see some tension between the forms and Buddhism, in the sense that in Platonism, when we talk about the forms, it is this sort of ontology, right? We're sort of discussing and fleshing out the ideas of ontology. And like you said, I found when I was a Buddhist that Buddhism in general seems very disinterested in ontology and epistemology.
Yeah.
It's sort of like ignored. It's just like, don't worry about that stuff, So do you see any tension there, or do you think it's almost like filling a gap maybe in that Buddhism just doesn't really address?
There is definitely a tension there, but for me that tension is creative. It's not something that negates each other. So, as we said, Buddhism has the tendency to focus on phenomenology, the phenomenology of the mind, of suffering and liberation. Platonism, although it is concerned with the liberation of the soul, also it has a broader subjects that it tackles that have to do with knowledge. Now, historically speaking, in accordance to the Pali canon, Siddhartha Gautama was not an anti-metaphysical, as some Buddhist traditions developed to be, but he was definitely non-metaphysical. Not because there is any indication that he believed that it is impossible to postulate some sort of metaphysical truth, but he seems to have thought of it as an obscuration, as an obstacle to liberation, because we're dealing with suffering as human beings, and suffering is like an arrow that got us struck, and we have to deal with the arrow. We don't have to think about the one who shot it, where he came from, why he did it, what kind of weapon he used, and so on and so on. And that non-metaphysical stance was inherited by the Buddhist traditions that followed, obviously. And eventually, with the emptiness only Madhyamaka, it turned to an anti-metaphysical stance. However, other Buddhist traditions, like Yogacara, for example, I don't know if you heard of them, they are somewhat idealist. Yeah, that's one example. And then you have Dzogchen, you have the emanative Trikaya doctrines of Mahayana, which understood that, okay, we're dealing with phenomenology, but at some point we have to somehow ground it to some cosmology and ontology to make it work, for the practitioner and for us to be able to communicate the message of awakening of the Buddha. So those traditions, they have many similarities with Platonic metaphysics, especially Neoplatonic metaphysics. As I said, they have the notion of emanation. in the Trikaya doctrine, you have the Dharmakaya, the body of truth of the Buddha, that is ineffable. It is the ground of all appearances. And then you have the Sambhogakaya. It is the enjoyment body of the Buddha, and it's more subtle. It's only energetic and pure vibrancy. And finally, you have the Nirmanakaya, which is that which is accessible to the senses. It is Dharmakaya, apparent to even the most mundane mind. So in that sense, you have many similarities, obviously, with the Trinitarian views of Plotinus, obviously, the one, the nous, and the soul. And as an elaboration of the Trikaya manifestation in the Tantric branch of Buddhism, in Vajrayana Buddhism, you also have the wisdom deities, the yidams, that appear spontaneously as an overflow, which also reminds us of Neoplatonic metaphysics, of Dharmakaya. And those wisdom deities, if we see them non-dually, which we do in Buddhism obviously, but if we see non-dually the forms of Plato and also how they were interpreted by his inheritors as the Henads, then you have a convergence. It's not like this convergence reduces all differences, and it shouldn't reduce all differences, but I don't see a contrast which makes it impossible for one to engage in both traditions at once. And what you said earlier, they do seem to fill out each other. They do seem to cover some weaknesses of the respective traditions. Platonism, it does have the tendency sometimes to over-theorize a metaphysical speculation, and Buddhism has the tendency to say, okay, metaphysical speculation is nice, that's good, but let's focus on the problem of the present moment. Let's not get carried away. Let's not reify a concept which we're not exactly certain if it is true or not. But on the other hand, as you said, which is a very apparent problem in Buddhism, they do emphasize non-conceptuality, and they would say focus on meditation, you don't have to read too much, and neglect, well, if we are to use their own terms, the inexhaustible energy of appearance of Dharmakaya, and understand why it is intelligible in particular ways. And I think one way to distinguish those two approaches, broadly speaking, and I emphasize this because when we talk about categories such as Platonism and Buddhism, they're enormous categories. It has so many subsections. I think it's useful to think that Platonism kind of has a vertical approach to liberation and knowledge, that you ascend to that which is transcendental other and always will be a transcendental otherness, whereas Buddhism emphasizes horizontal recognition, the immanence of that which is true beyond concepts in the present moment. So if one engages in both traditions, I believe that it creates a very nice balance as an individual practitioner, but also in the field of comparative analysis. There are many things which we can take out of.
I'd absolutely agree. I've noticed it can be very, very beneficial for Platonists that are maybe in that kind of vertical mindset where we definitely have a problem in the Platonic community of kind of over rationalization. The people who are kind of obsessed with the charts and the graphs and all of this complex ontology and theology and all of that stuff's interesting. All of that stuff's great. But I do find in Buddhism, it helps to be a little bit more embodied and actually get you into doing the practical aspects of it. You mentioned the sort of parable of the man who's been hit by the arrow, and I was thinking about that when we were talking about that, because sometimes I feel like us Platonists, we're the guy hit by the arrow, and we do want to know, no, where did the arrow come from, and what kind of arrowhead is this, and is this poisoned or not? Like, we want to ask all those questions, but we maybe ignore the work of actually just yanking the arrow out.
Yeah, but you know, we Platonists have a point when we pose those questions, because this is what it leads knowledge forward for mankind. And you can see perhaps these tendencies, how it manifested in the civilizational level. So in the West, because pretty much all of our science, theology, and philosophy was affected by Platonism, you ended up with this immense progress in the outer world. So you had this notion of vertical ascendancy that at some point it got reified, and we just ended up thinking of transcendence only in the aspect of the outer world. And so we
Hmm.
ended up having a civilization with great materialistic achievements and technology that would have been unthinkable in past generations, but then we kind of lost the inward peace. Yet, when you go to the pole of the East in Asia, you have all these cultures that were mainly influenced by Buddhism or other non-Buddhist traditions, which emphasize that horizontal recognition of feeling at peace, at the wholesomeness of each passing moment, and they have retained a rich tradition of inner peace and inner realization. But then, on the other hand, they themselves, arguably, this is what I believe, reified that inner peace, and then they were stuck when it comes to outer progress. What they could do as a culture, as a civilization. So
I think that's a really interesting idea.
yeah,
Can you kind of explain a little bit more? I mean, I think I get what you're getting at, that maybe having less of a concern about that kind of vertical hierarchy, and maybe even just understanding or trying to understand the nature of reality, by not focusing on that and focusing more on inner peace, it sort of maybe stunts our ability in some sense to develop those kinds of things that have been developed in the West. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
can you repeat the last part, please?
Yeah, that when we're focusing on that inner peace and making that really central to our way of life, and not concerning ourselves with the sort of nature of reality necessarily, that maybe that prevents us from making those kinds of developments that we've seen, like the material developments that we've seen in the West.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there are many traditions in the East which kind of overemphasize the wholeness of being, of Dharmakaya, for example, in Trikaya Buddhism. And then they kind of neglect their own teachings, which state that Dharmakaya is not inactive, it's not inert, it spontaneously manifests in inexhaustible and infinite ways. And although there are teachings in within Buddhism that want to overcome this inertia, on the other hand, there are other counter tendencies within those traditions that kind of lead the practitioner to become inert. So going back to how this index started, it does make sense to, yes, get the arrow out, but also ask who shoot it and why. Like, you can do both. I don't think the one negates the other, and I might disagree with Buddha Sakyamuni on this one. He might overstated the importance of non-speculation of metaphysics.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's also an order of operations, I guess, too. We can, if it is urgent that we take the arrow out, doesn't mean we can't ask all of those questions afterwards. We shouldn't think that just because maybe we don't need to do that right away, that we shouldn't do it at all.
You have to answer because perhaps that shooter is going to shoot you again. So you have to ask, who is it?
Yeah.
And why is he shooting me in the first place? Important question.
Yeah, it's a good question to ask. Can you explain the concept of Dharmakaya a bit? I think a lot of people who listen to this might not know what that means.
So Dharmakaya is the indivisible union of bliss and emptiness. Emptiness is the total non-conceptuality and deification of every fabricated concept of the mind, including the mind itself. And in Buddhism, concepts are kind of the same with things. So, for example, I have this glass here, it is a concept. The glass exists only as a concept within my mind. So, there's not a thing in itself as a glass. So, the deification of all concepts means that you attain nirvana, you attain the absolute that's beyond concepts, beyond perception and non-perception. But in the case of the Dharmakaya doctrines, they do become a little bit cataphatic, saying that there's bliss there. And bliss is this unconditioned wholeness of being, that is this one with that emptiness.
Yeah. I was just reading Plotinus the other day and thinking about this kind of idea as well, which is that, he says of the one that we're kind of wrong if we just think of it as like nothing, that it is still the good. It is still the cause of beauty and all of these things. And it's sort of beyond what you could possibly imagine. And I think it's possible that bliss might be the word that we're definitely borrowing it from the East if we would apply it to the one in any kind of way. But I think that might be a little bit of what you're getting at, that there is still this.
But it's not wrong to do so, to borrow such words, because Plotinus does equate the union with the one as an orgasmic union. It's like seeing your loved one whom you haven't seen for countless years, and you get excited through your body and your mind senses, and you just jump into it and get unified. In that unification, you lose yourself, but not in the nihilistic sense, when the sense that you overflow beyond yourself.
Yeah, and I think we lose that in Platonism sometimes. We forget that when we're talking about things like kenosis, we're talking about, like you said, like it's this ecstatic union. It's an experience that would completely, it would be like a nirvana experience, right? It would completely change everything about you, and is something that is supremely good. It's not simply, a lack of sensation, like a total lack of sensation, thought, and whatever.
That's very good that you mentioned this, because many Platonists must think, okay, and why would I engage myself with Buddhism, as it seems that it just over focus on conceptuality and so on. So one exciting aspect why a Platonist might be motivated to engage with Buddhism is that you engage with lineages of practice which are unbroken, that have to do with direct insight into the nature of the mind. And then you reread the text of Plotinus and you say, oh, I do not know that Plotinus was, for example, a Dzogchen practitioner, a Zen practitioner. And why do I say this? Because many of the methods that are used to this day in schools such as Zen, Dzogchen, which for those who don't know, it's another Tibetan Buddhist school, and other paths of contemplation, of sudden enlightenment within Buddhism, they are described in the text of Plotinus. But when you approach these texts purely theoretically, and you lack that experience of praxis, you might miss that point that Plotinus is doing. And not only Plotinus seems to have described contemplative methods of direct perception of non-duality that align with more modern schools of Buddhism, later developments of Buddhism, but I would argue that they also align to a certain degree with the Pali Buddhism, of Buddha Sakyamuni. For example, when it comes to stripping away all that it is not of your hypercosmic essence. And despite the fact that Buddha Sakyamuni did not speak of any essence itself, obviously, he does speak in the Pali Canon with the terms of the unconditioned, the unfabricated, the unmade, which makes liberation possible. And how do you reach that unfabricated, unmade, unconditioned that is nirvana? By anatta, by saying, not this, not that, this has no self, this also has no self, but who or what is that which recognizes that all those concepts and entities have no self essence on their own as they exist, meaning independently. This is basically an apophatic method that Buddhist community used, and Plotinus also used clearly in his aphoretic method of how to strip away all that it is not unconditioned, and then what does remain? Something remains that you have to experience through direct insight, but you can't really speak about it in positive terms.
Right. It is that apophasis, that sort of via negativa that you hear in Plotinus, and that's a huge reason why I love Plotinus so much. You know, when I started reading it, it reminded me a lot of things that I sort of learned, not necessarily as like Buddhist doctrines or ideas, but just from practice, from doing a lot of meditation. A lot of the things that he talks about, you know, the cutting away of these different sensations and kind of going inward toward the one, like, you know, I've walked through a bit of that through practice and know what he's talking about. And, you know, it means that to me, a guy like Plotinus is really a mystic. Like, he is doing these practices. You know, we wouldn't have called it maybe meditation back then, but this is what it is. It's very close to what Buddhist meditation is all about. But I think that's really interesting, this idea that maybe the Pali canon, like you talked about kind of Pali canon Buddhism versus, you know, these later developments. And this has been one of those things that Ken Wheeler, you know, a prominent YouTube Platonist out there, has talked about, that what Shakyamuni Buddha was talking about in the Pali Canon is maybe different than what came later. Is that, do you see that present? I guess that there's a different
think
Buddhism back then.
that later Buddhist traditions kind of reified that non-metaphysical stance that we talked about of Buddhist community to anti-metaphysics. They become hardcore reductionists, which can't be really seen in the earliest scripts of the Pali Canon. And that reification began with the Abhidharmis, which also quite early stages of Pali Buddhism, but later than the earliest ones. And then this got blown away through the radicalization of dependent origination by Nagarjuna. So if one simply reads the earliest Pali texts, what he gets is like a pure practical therapy. And some might disagree, as we do in some sense, when it comes to complete non-speculation of metaphysics. But nonetheless, it is not anti-metaphysics. So it does leave the space for someone who will experience liberation then to have the freedom to dive into speculation, into scientific work, into methodology, without negating the very principles of practice necessarily of the Buddhism that he practices. So I do think that later developments kind of overdid it with the anatta. I do think there are misinterpretations of that, in the sense that it becomes definitely metaphysical nihilism. So it is some sort of a statement that no metaphysical gnosis is possible. So even if someone says, oh, I'm following the non-self doctrine in a way that is not nihilistic, because that's an extreme that the emptiness only school rejects, nonetheless, I call bullshit on that. It is definitely metaphysical nihilism. And okay, perhaps you don't want to kill yourself, but it is a form of nihilism. And more than that, it does raise the question which I stated earlier. Yes, everything that appears and has origination has a cessation, and thus it has no independent, self-isolated existence within time. Yeah, that's true. But who makes that recognition? And since I cannot find anywhere within space and within time that who, or whatever you want to call it, which makes that recognition, what is left is left the intuitive knowledge, the direct knowledge, the participatory gnosis, that that recognition comes from something beyond.
Hmm.
And the
Yeah.
Buddha Sakyamuni chose not to speak about this in any positive terms. However, this does not mean that we should reify the non-self.
Right. Yeah. It seems like at that early level, the Buddha was talking more about it's sort of non-metaphysical rather than anti-metaphysical. Is that kind of what you're
Exactly.
saying? Yeah.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely see how the idea of no soul, Anatta gets kind of reified, like you said, into this idea where it's rejection of the soul, where maybe that wasn't really what the Buddha was getting at. It is more like, hey, don't be concerned about these questions, is kind of how I always interpreted him at that early level. Like, hey, focus on the practices. Don't worry about this or that. It's not going to matter at the end of the day.
Exactly. And if you study the historical development of Buddhism, you get this sense that some Buddhist schools were more concerned not to be mistaken as some sort of a Hindu self doctrine of salvation, rather
Hmm.
than just being concerned about truth itself and about liberation itself, because you do have some developments within Buddhism that get closer to the self doctrines, the Atman doctrines of the Hindu mysticism. But then you get this immediate pushback within Buddhist tradition that, oh no, don't get there because now you're smiting in Atman, where we should not do that. That's just a no-no. And now you have just blasphemed Buddha and everything that is sacred. Get the heck out of here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's easy to forget as a Westerner the interplay between all of those traditions in the East, that, there was all of this tension between, Advaita Vedanta, Shankara and the Buddhist teachers, and, they were kind of debating each other all the time, and probably influenced each other in positive and negative ways because of that.
Yeah. And you know what's funny? Like Hindus think that Advaita Vedantins are like Buddhists.
Right.
And and schools that kind of are close to what Advaita Vedanta is saying, like Dzogchen, which speaks about Rigpa, which is primordial awareness, are accused of being close to being like Advaita Vedantins. So obviously, if someone steps away from these intersectarian conflicts and theoretical debates, one can understand that those schools, they are in a communion with each other and they have influenced each other, as you said, both in positive and negative ways. Nonetheless, what does this concern a modern Western? Why do we get caught up so much in those ancient debates, and we get sometimes even passionate about them? What concerns us is, first and foremost, experiencing the wholeness of liberation, experiencing the waking up to the here and now, the atemporal here and now, and propelling ourselves into creative activities that are beneficial for our own self and our communities, and possibly do our part for this dark age to end and pass on to something superior. And not to um, carry on the karma of intersectarian bitterness that have no meaning, and it negates the salvificatory project of the traditions that we supposedly follow, because that conflict that grasping into those debates is samsara. The cycle of suffering just keeps perpetuating. And as a final statement about this subject, for me, I think it's more useful, and especially if you're a Platonist, you can agree with that, to take a step back and see what's perennial about these discourses, these interactions between traditions. What principle, what can we derive from those discussions and formulate an even superior theory of consciousness and being and awakening.
Yeah. And, I think we are blessed that we don't have to get ourselves involved in these sort of sectarian differences in the East, because they're not really, we can view it almost like a more disinterested third party when we're looking into it. We don't have to buy into all of that. But I also love that, within Platonism, there's always been a tendency to absorb as much as it can. That's good, right? It absorbed a lot of aspects of Aristotelianism that it thought were valuable and incorporated that into its ideas. It incorporated a lot of Stoicism and maybe even some Buddhism through people like Pyrrho. In the early sort of skeptical academy, there may have been some Buddhist influence there too, but I don't know if that's 100%, but there's some theories out there with that.
Some say that Pyrrho was the student of Pyrrho, who wrote down his main principles of teaching, was the first text of Buddhism ever.
Really?
Yeah.
That's one of the earliest Buddhist texts is Pyrrho, you're saying?
No, not one of the earliest, because there are no Buddhist texts prior to the text that was written down of the tenets of Pyrrho. And if one has a one-to-one comparative analysis of what this text of the principles of practice of Pyrrho states, it's basically anicca, anatta, and dukkha, but in Hellenic terms.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I think we could probably do a whole podcast just on that. But what you're talking about with practice, then, I think is a good segue into theurgy. So obviously, theurgy in the Western and Platonic tradition is our sort of attempt to embody this and reach toward the divine, so to speak. And you've seen a lot of those parallels between that and what's going on in Eastern Tantra. And so I definitely see it too. There's books like Gregory Shaw's book, Hellenic Tantra, where he talked about that a little bit more in the sort of Shaiva context of Tantra, but there's the Buddhist context there too. And so maybe you could unpack a little bit for us, theurgy from your perspective in Tantra. Or, I mean, are these the same things? Are they related, or how are they related? I'm curious how you see those two.
No, they're not the same thing, and it is wrong to state that it is the same concept entirely. Nonetheless, I do believe that the operative principles of waking up to the true nature of things are the same. So dogmatically, there are many differences. Yet, when it comes to the practice itself, because the structure of awakening consciousness, I argue, is perennial, they kind of end up into the same things of practice, of utilizing certain aspects of the felt experience of being human in a way that propels him to awakening. So what are those aspects? First of all, you have the self-emptying aspect. In Theurgy, we speak about the Udenia. Gregory Shaw has spoken much about it. He has written about it. His work is wonderful. So, in Theurgy, what you want to do as a practitioner is not to invoke the gods in a way that perhaps some exoteric Christians would, in a way I request this and that, I have a list of wishes that want to be actualized, but you want to step outside of the way of the God's power. You don't want to involve your ego into it, because when you involve the lower faculties of the soul, what we would call ego in modern terms, then you doing goitia, like lower forms of magic, rather than theurgy. So if you don't begin with this self-emptying, the euthenia become a receptacle, or in other terms you might say your psyche resembles the hora, the cosmic hora, then whatever you do after as theurgic practice is not entirely theurgy. And you basically doing some kind of new age form of practice, which is not what would Iamblichus approve. And this self-emptying, of course, as you know very well, and as I believe most know, is kind of the starting point of Buddhism as well, although they will frame this in different terms. But emptiness is that, but you kind of go into a different vantage point. You have to empty yourself, your mind, through any fabricated concepts, even your sense of identity as a concept. Doctrinally, there are different presentations, but in practice, there is none. And then you have the euthenia, you have fantasia, imagination, but not imagination in the sense of how we use it in common language, that I'm thinking of some sort of a scenery or an entity or whatever else. When you are in this state of euthenia, you have emptied yourself and you have become an active receptacle. So there is this sense of active passivity, and you simply turn subtly your attention towards the divine and the gods. Images appear spontaneously, or they might not appear, but usually if you are in this genuine state of euthenia, images will appear spontaneously. And those images, they are not mundane imagination, they are actually representational forms of that which is suprasensible. They are the representational forms of that which is non-representational. That's an accurate way to say it. Mm-hmm. So they are the gods directly communicating with you through various stages and levels of intermediaries, of course, not in the sense of you get like another entity that is whole divine speaking to you like you are Moses in the mountain or anything like that. but there's this communication non-dually.
Right. Yeah, they're coming to you in that sort of way.
Yep. I'm sorry, what did you say?
No, I was just agreeing with you. Yeah.
You have euthenia, you have fantasia, you have the use of asima onomata, ineffable names, the vibrationary sound of the formulation of certain words which have direct efficacy on the formulations of the universe. And the obvious comparison is with the mantras, and that's something very important within Tantra as well as in Theurgy through the asima onomata. You have the subtle body mechanics, the luminous body. We have the avoides ochima in Neoplatonism. They have the subtle body, and obviously the way the anatomy of the subtle body will differ between traditions. But yet again, I would argue that when you put those things into practice and you get the experience of what they point towards, there's no difference, because the structure of consciousness is perennial. They're not speaking about another consciousness that is, I don't know, somewhat in a different universe with no communion between each other. It's the same phenomenology with different doctrinal interpretation, but the same felt experience, if you actually have a felt experience of those things and not speak about them simply theoretically. And then you have the divine marriage. We already said that Plotinus thought about the union with the One, the realization of ultimacy as some sort of erotic union. And this goes all the way back to Plato in the Symposium, which can be interpreted as some form of Platonic Tantra, and those same understanding of the union of polarity in an erotic sense also is expressed within Proclean theology, and I'm not sure about the Amblichus, but possibly Amblichus as well. Obviously in Tantra you have a great emphasis on that erotic image, more so than in Platonism. In Platonism it's more abstract, more contemplative, but they do utilize it as well, and they do understand, for example, the recognition of Dharmakaya as this sort of sexual union. This is how they depict it in iconography, of the primordial luminosity of the mind with its emptiness. And then finally, sorry, just to complete the list of sameness in operative principles, you have the ineffable silence. You get through those gateways of segments of felt experience that is sanctified because you have emptied yourself from the lower faculties of your soul, and then you end up with the ineffable as sacred silence, which then does not remain inert. And that's very important, because in Tantra, both in Buddhist Tantra but also in non-Buddhist Tantra like Saivism, they do criticize a lot traditions of recognition of ultimacy that understand that felt experience as, then okay, you get into the ultimate and that's it. There's no action in the ultimate. So they emphasize that ultimacy is not inactive. Then there is remanifestation. So you get into Dharmakaya and then you manifest again through Sambhogakaya and Nirmanakaya. The same schema there is in Neoplatonism, specifically in Proclus, with the Moni, the procession, and the return. Moni, Prodos, Epistrophy. Which for me, it's the same phenomenology of awakened consciousness.
Yeah, I think there's this belief sometimes that, once you reach the one, it's over. It's the drop of water back into the ocean kind of concept. And, like you're saying, there's this cycle of activity. There's still this cycle of procession and return that is going on all the time. And that is central to theurgy, right? That we're part of that process no matter what. Even if we are going back, we return again to here and go through this kind of endless cycle in a way, maybe not incarnating the whole time, but still, that motion is always happening.
The awakened being remanifests. He does not reincarnate. And what's the difference? Remanifestation, it's an act of freedom. Reincarnation is an impulse. You don't have a choice, or you think you don't have a choice.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I thought one of the things you said that was really interesting was about the idea of the ego. And, if you're coming to theurgy and you've got this, ego, then you might be doing something closer to sorcery, I guess, Goetia, if you're not being careful about it. And I just see so much of that. I actually worry for people sometimes when I hear certain people are getting into theurgic practices, and especially getting into it from the sort of Renaissance magic kind of tradition. And I can tell that they haven't maybe done the personal work on themselves that is requisite to really do that and not damage yourself.
It's a problem in theurgic Platonism that unfortunately our lineages of practice have been cut off. It's a huge issue, and that's another big motivator factor for someone who is truly genuinely interested in the essence of practice of Platonism, to connect with some sort of a lineage that is still ongoing in practice, mostly in the Far East. And this lineage does not have to be Buddhism per se. I also believe Saivic Tantra has many similarities and compatibilities with Platonism. Advaita Vedanta is also wonderful. Tao, there are options there. The important thing is to connect with a realized teacher, that you feel something very palpable and powerful between you and the teacher. And when it comes to, okay, and how do I reconcile being engaged within Asian tradition, whereas I'm a Westerner and devote towards Platonism, that's your own responsibility. You can't do that. You can go through this process when you get that which is beyond words to get. So when you have certain series of realizations of the essence beyond this text that what they try to describe, they will become more illuminated to you. And that's something which I've experienced many times, and I keep experiencing with my engagement in Buddhism and Platonism concurrently. That I go within Buddhism and I get in direct contact that is experiential with certain principles, and then I return to the Platonic texts and they make more sense to me. Not because I project an conceptual idea that I took from Buddhism and I do this anachronism and say, oh, this is what this Platonic text is describing, but when it comes to the mechanics of the mind, the structure of insight, that's the same. And you understand better Plato, especially Plotinus, and the Theurgists as well. So when you get into this theologic text without those realizations, without, especially very important, the interpersonal connection with someone who has gone through various phases of being engaged with these supramundane aspects of the appearance of existence, it's very easy to get lost. It's very easy to misunderstand certain things that you read in texts. It's very easy to get some experiences that are extraordinary and interpret them in a way that is totally wrong. And the Amblichus warns about those things explicitly. He gives this example where there is a group of theological practitioners that invoke Apollo, and there is this figure that is luminous that appears in the group, and those who are inexperienced, they say, oh, that's Apollo, and the Amblichus just sitting very relaxed and saying, hey, relax boys, this is not really Apollo, this is just a ghost who pretends to be something more than he is. And if you're not aware of these phenomenological signs, of the differences of how certain entities can appear, you'll get most likely lost. And this is what you see also in the New Age currents. Most of the events that are described in New Age, they would be categorized from a strict Iamblichian theological perspective as either the fantasies, the lower fantasy of the soul being augmented, or daimonic appearances in which daimons, they have this presence that is mixed with truity and falsity.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there was a story I heard from this one girl who thought she was praying to Aphrodite. And she said, I've been praying to Aphrodite, and Aphrodite keeps telling me that I need to give her more offerings every day. And her demands are getting more and more intense, and she's tormenting me. And even when I'm going around like my normal life, I can hear her in my mind tormenting me that she wants more sacrifices. And it wasn't till I prayed to the Mother Mary that it all went away. And, what I took away from it was, this is a really a problem with us not having a more established sort of priesthood about these things, because anybody who knows about these subjects would go, that's not Aphrodite. That's some daimon at best. Or maybe you're just delusional, but it's certainly not Aphrodite, because she doesn't need your sacrifices. It's not something that she would want from you, not in that way. And so, that's part of the way that I look at some of these traditions. Like, I think it's good to plug yourself into these teachers wherever you can find them. And like you said, we're all experiencing the same reality, right? We may have this Buddhist terminology or this Shaiva terminology, but at the end of the day, the reality that we're experiencing, the spiritual reality, is the same reality. And the benefit I see in tying in with some of those folks is the guidance part of it. They know the road better than a lot of us do. And they can guide us in a way where they can say, hey, don't do that practice, or avoid that for now. You're not ready for that. things like that can be very, very helpful. And, until we've got our feet under us, our legs under us, and we can kind of, I guess, produce that internally, it is, I think, very valuable to get some advice from those folks just from a practical standpoint.
Yes, and to state some of the positive things about these New Age movements is that obviously we're in a phase in the West and perhaps even worldwide where there is this need for new forms of religiosity to arise, forms of religiosity that are more spontaneous and organic and freed from the rigid constructs of big institutions. So it's not like New Age movements, in my view, are all bad, and there is something positive and creative into it as a potential. The only thing that they have to do is take a bit more seriously those matters that we just presented and connect with a living lineage. Find a master, a teacher with whom there is resonance with the teachings of the lineage as well. And this does not mean that you're going to lose your identity, that unique thing that is emerging, because Tantra, in its non-institutional form, is and was from its beginnings an experimentation in how to awaken to the non-dual nature of the mind and how to embody it in a way that is even antinomian, even controversial. So it is innately non-institutional. And for me, that's the perfect balance for someone who is trying to formulate within him and in his community something which is genuinely religious, but on the other hand, not fixated in a certain institutional forms that demand the destruction of your unique individuality. And Tantra is perfect for that. You gain recognition of the nature of the mind through Tantra. You'll understand primary operative principles of ritual action that are proven throughout the centuries to elevate, to expand consciousness. But then you can modulate those principles in the way that is organic for you. Tantra on its own does not demand from you to stop being you.
Right. And I think even in a broader sense, I don't think it means that you have to stop being a Platonist to practice these things or learn from these teachers. I think the fact of the matter is we don't have a complete understanding of Theurgy from the Iamblichean standpoint. We don't have some book that explains exactly how to do all of the theurgic practices, and we don't have those, intact lineages. And I don't think it's necessarily about giving up, Platonism and just adopting Buddhism wholesale or Shaivik Tantrism or whatever. I think it's about plugging yourself into people who know how to do these things and have a very strong understanding of it and can teach you it in a way that is going to be beneficial to you and help develop and deepen your practice.
You absolutely do not need to negate your Platonist identity and beliefs and philosophical inquiry. For me, what I've done so far in my practice is to gain an understanding in the field of felt experience and in the theoretical field of the operative principles of Tantra, and then reflect that back from the writings that we do have. We do have some historical records of the practice of the mystery schools. Not much, but we do have. We do have records of what the Greeks did, for example, in pre-Christian times. Not much, but we do have some segments. And then we do have the theoretical principles from Iamblichus and Proclus. What we don't have is, as you said, a complete ritual text written by, let's say, for example, from Iamblichus that goes step by step of what to do during theurgic ritual. But as soon as you get a grasp, a theoretical grasp, and an experiential grasp of the operative principles of a tantric sadhana, you can get those principles combined with that information that you do have, which is not something poor. It's not complete, as you said, but it's very rich in theory.
Hmm.
And the result is not a reconstruction of the past, but a revival of lineages that were cut off. And this a genuine revival because, well, the gods are beyond time. Just because in linear history there is a cutting off of a lineage, this does not mean that the essence of the lineage, which is beyond the mundane world, is lost. It is there, accessible, if certain conditions are met. And those certain conditions can be conceptualized in today's world as the principles of the phenomenology of awakening. That is
Yeah.
perennial because consciousness is universal. You get those principles, you understand them conceptually and in felt experience, and then the latest stage of reviving a lost Neoplatonic lineage is, I would dare say, easy.
Yeah. And I don't think the goal, and I do think there's a problem within Platonism sometimes, but I don't think that the goal should be, perfect reconstruction of exactly the way that they were doing it 2000 years ago, even from a theurgic standpoint. Like, it seems to me like it's far more important that we engage directly with this reality, the reality that is a part of awakening the spiritual world, to engage with that directly is more important than, perfectly reconstructing the rites as they may have been 1500, 2000 years ago. And insofar as that's even possible, I have this kind of thought too, that even if we did find this great work from Iamblichus that had all the rituals written down, I still feel like we'd be missing something, of the guidance and that you get from a teacher that can actually walk you through it properly and help you understand what you're going through and what you're experiencing. I have a feeling we might still be missing something even if we had that stuff.
And we have to keep in mind that Platonism is not an Abrahamic religion. There's not this belief that there is this written word in a book that remains fixated until creation is remade or something like that.
Hmm.
It is an ongoing scientific and philosophical process. Therefore, remaining faithful in the Iamblichian and Proclean spirit would mean that we participate in this ongoing process, not not grasping a past that it is past.
Yeah, I like the word science you use there, because I do think that that's the right way to think about it sometimes, that it is like a spiritual science. And just like any science, like those truths are there for us to be able to discover and find again. We're not reliant upon an old book or something in order to access that truth. We have the ability to figure it out, but it does definitely help if you're being sort of led by somebody who's already been there, so to speak. And that's sort of the benefit of finding those intact lineages. I think sometimes people worry about the lineage thing, that it's about legitimacy. Maybe it's from Julius Evola or something, that we're like frauds or something if we don't if we don't have a lineage or something. Guanan kind of has the same thing. But, I look at it much more from this kind of science standpoint of like, hey, this is a real reality. It exists out there. You can go tap into it yourself, by yourself, but you're probably going to have, it's kind of like, I'm going to go hiking without a map. It's like, sure, you can
Mm.
do it. You might get eaten by a bear. I don't know. But having somebody that can guide you is just very beneficial, and you're going to make more progress faster and understand it better as you do.
And I would say that the Volian argument has been blown out of proportions.
Mhm.
Evla made the statement that for most individuals in the modern world, accessing initiatic states of mind on their own, spontaneously, is very unlikely to happen. That's why he emphasized that getting initiated to a living lineage is like very important. Nonetheless, just by studying the life of Evola himself, obviously he was aware that self-initiation is possible,
Mhm.
and self-initiation is an event that is being described in the initiatic lineages of both Hindu and Buddhist traditions. It's just that it's not accessible to most.
Yeah, oh, no, I absolutely agree. So I'm curious, you were talking about a little bit about the future, I guess, of these things in New Age traditions as well. Like, where do you see us going in the West spiritually? I think there's a drive right now for um, maybe a return to Christianity in the broader culture, but I think that's motivated by a broader return to religion. And I agree with you that that is bringing about other forms of religion. We are seeing a return of Platonism, paganism, these theurgic practices, people interest in Buddhism. But I'm just curious to get your thoughts on kind of how you see the future of religion and spirituality developing in the West.
Well, it's hard to say how it will develop on a mass scale. What I see right now is that there is this dire need for a religion of the heart to return. What do I mean by this? A religion that is not dictated so much by dialectical reasoning and by any form of institution. That even those tendencies that you mentioned about seeing a return to Christianity, I don't think most people that get into, let's say, Christian Orthodoxy right now, they embody mainstream Orthodox Christianity. They create their own niche of Orthodox Christianity, which is quite specific, and many of the Orthodox priests would find it even perhaps blasphemous.
Mm-hmm.
Nonetheless, they would categorize themselves as Orthodox Christians. And obviously, this is not only seen in those converts towards Christianity, it is seen in pagans very much, obviously, but also in people that they get involved in Far Eastern traditions. So what I do predict is kind of like what I'm doing with Politia Mandala. I predict that there's going to be this spontaneous uprising of many small intentional communities within the city and outside of the city environment throughout the West, where they're going to experiment a lot. They're going to go through a phase of what happened in the India and Tibetan Plateau and Nepal during the first phase of Tantra, where there was a lot of secretism, a lot of intersectarian dialogue, and a lot of experimentation of practice. And out of that, new traditions are going to arise. The already existing traditions are going to be reformulated, perhaps in radical ways. And who knows what's going to
Mm-hmm.
happen. But this is my prediction. But I do have also another prediction, which perhaps is even more exciting. That in that process, something else is going to happen, which hasn't happened so far in the known history of mankind, and that is the unification of modern scientific paradigms, which were nurtured in materialistic monism, with non-dual consciousness. And you do have these cutting edge fields at the moment emerging where it is studied the possibility, which is a big step for mainstream science to discuss those things, the possibility that perhaps non-dual consciousness, pure and total consciousness, is fundamental and primary to space-time, instead of the geometry of space-time being the fundamental principle of the universe. So if
Mm-hmm.
this happens, if there is this union of the science, the spiritual science of contemplative traditions with the science that got developed in the last centuries, we might be tackling something truly unique with no comparison so far in history.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I feel like at some level we're maybe in a new axial age, that time period where we did see the emergence of Buddhism and Platonism and all these other things. I feel sometimes like maybe we're in something similar to that where it's like it is this like melting pot of all of these ideas and people are I feel like there's going to be something new. At some level, I almost think that it's not necessarily going to be the reestablishment of something we've done in the past, although some people are arguing that that's what we ought to do. it does seem that we're moving towards almost like a synthesis of something, and it's on the horizon. But I agree. I don't think we've seen it yet. Um,
And we should not
and
see it yet, because if we see it, it's dead.
yeah,
The fact that we're not seeing it is what makes it alive.
right. Yeah, like there's a mystery there to it. Like you can't quite put your finger on it, but I think if you're attuned to it, you can kind of tell something's coming. Like there is something in the way that we're moving towards, but we're not there yet. And I do think you're right that there may be this element of unifying with science as we've understood it for the last few hundred years, where we, and I think we have to go through that. We have to go through that kind of unification because the way that we look at the world today is scientific. You know, the average person, the average normie, so to speak, is sort of a scientific materialist just by default, you know, not in a deep intellectual way, but they just look at the world in this very materialistic and scientific sort of way. And I think unless we find a way to make the spiritual and the scientific come together, I don't know if we'll have that sort of uh, bigger revolution, so to speak, where everybody like this becomes seeps deeper into the culture. Because right now it just seems like there's a divide, right? Like there's science is the real reality and materialism is the real reality, and the spiritual stuff is just woo woo nonsense. You know, that seems to be the dominant paradigm at this point, but that's changing, like you said.
Well, you're absolutely right that if there is not that paradigm change within science, I don't think we're going to see en masse a paradigm shift in our cultures and civilizations. What I would like to say is that there is this sense of divide between spirituality and science. But again, these are modern categories, modern divides to be more exact. Plato, Proclus, Plotinus, they saw no such divide. They saw no such divide. Plotinus would not say that all the astrophysic revelations of how the physical universe operates contradicts his theology and his experience of unification with the One. On the contrary, I believe he would be very much excited. Plato the same. Plato was seeing the heavenly spheres and was inspired about the good, the beautiful, and the just. And perhaps Iamblichus and Proclus, they're more medieval-like in their mindset, but they were nonetheless philosophers. They would not have, I do not believe they would have any objection in this unification of modern science with Platonic philosophy and practice. And the problem with science is not science itself, because that's something I'm seeing in certain counterculture movements of today's spiritual revolutionary cycles, that because science is, as you said, materialistic, then we just have to do away with that, and they almost become anti-scientific in their approach of life as a reaction to the materialistic paradigm that was dominant for so many centuries. Yet
Mm-hmm.
the problem with science is just its ontology. If you change the ontology from materialistic monism to some form of phenology or whatever else that might make sense in the scientific field where there is the principle of non-dualism, then science is wonderful. Why would you reject that? Like, the masters that you follow will not reject that. The Buddhist masters, what they did was basically a science of phenomenology of the mind. They would not put it in such way, but this is what they did. This is why you have texts where it is clearly stated, you do this practice and these signs appear as you do this practice. What is this? This is the phenomenology of the mind. And likewise, we discussed about Iamblichus some minutes ago, how he had developed quite thorough descriptions of what happens when a daimon appears, what happens when an angel appears, an archangel, a god. There are signs. That's phenomenology. So, in today's world, the today's Iamblichian disciples and Buddha Sakyamunis, why would they reject science? Why would they not utilize science in a way that this phenomenology of the mind gets deepened, which of course the phenomenology of the mind is equivalent to the phenomenology of being, right? Why would they do that? It is nonsensical. That's why I do not really get when some traditionalists and some of the counter culture spiritualists, they emphasize so much their anti-science, and they will evoke that the academia is steeped with materialists. Yeah, so what? Go out there, make your own research, make your own argumentation, and change the academia from the inside. This change is already happening. Participate in that. If you do believe that reality is beyond materialism and you're smart enough to engage in high theory and you have your own experiences and you can be a scientist, why not be a scientist and prove it to the world?
Right. Yeah. At some level, they almost seem like this sort of reactionary anti-science sentiment is, in some sense, I think, accepting what science is saying, or at least saying, like, we don't have a counter to what you're saying, so we're just going to reject you outright. Where I think you're right that we should be countering this with better science. And the way that I look at it is, it's not that science is wrong. I just think it's, like you said, it's got bad ontology. It's been incomplete. And their whole argument that everything is material and there is nothing beyond the material is itself a metaphysical, non-material argument, you know? So it ends up kind of eating its own tail eventually anyways. And it seems that at least some scientists and some people in that community are starting to figure that out. And that's, you know, we are seeing this, maybe the first domino of that change is where we do realize that consciousness is primary to the universe, that it is there at a level beyond the physical. And, you know, there's a lot of evidence that's starting to support that, even on a scientific level. I think they just maybe don't know what to do about it. You know, like they've got this whole paradigm that's built around the materialist version. And I think if it is true that consciousness precedes material, it's such a revolution to the way that they look at the world that I think at this point they just kind of have their heads in the sand.
Yeah, but it is changing. You do
It
have
is.
prominent figures coming out from the fields of phenomenology and more specific microphenomenology, which deals with very subtle states of consciousness, like, for example, the state between sleeping and being wakeful, or the state of being aware of deep sleep, where they get outright going that, oh, perhaps we should just switch gears a little bit. Perhaps we should not be so much attached to materialistic monism. And you do have the movement of panpsychism within scientific fields, within fields related to the philosophy of the mind, with studies in mindfulness, where I'm at, studies in consciousness, and even theoretical physics. So it's not like there is no energy whatsoever towards overcoming materialistic monism. And I do think that it is dying out.
Mhm. I mean, even amongst the materialists, I do see it dying out a little bit in that they seem to have already shifted away from kind of calling themselves materialists, and it's more they're physicalists, you know, and they do accept that some things are not material in the literal sense, you know. I think it's hard to hold that position when they're talking about things like field theory, like quantum field theory. It's like most of these things aren't actually material in a sort of atomic sense, and I think they realize that. So we are making some progress, and I do agree it may take a little bit of time. I think these things do change slowly, but I can see all the pieces are in place. You know, the alternate way of looking at it is there, and there will be a kind of tipping point eventually where that theory, I think, becomes dominant. And who knows, maybe that's going to take 30, 50 years, 100 years even, but that's a small blip in the grand scheme of things to move away from what's been the dominant paradigm for at least 300 years, right?
Exactly, and I do think we live in a very exciting times. For those who are intimately engaged with contemplative traditions, well, now is the best time to participate in this current and become part of history. I do think that those who will involve themselves intensely in those changes, they will be perhaps not with hominidity, with their name being known, but definitely with their presence and their contribution, they will remain in history. If we are hopeful and optimistic that we won't destroy ourselves in the meantime and fall into another dark age, if we do
Yeah.
overcome these challenges that are happening worldwide, I think, as we said earlier, perhaps in 50 or 60 years, or even more than that, depending on how you want to look at it, perhaps humanity is going to look back and see what we're doing at this very moment in time and think culturally like this was such a dark age. We were putting so much energy, effort, and worry into things which are truly insubstantial, both literally and metaphorically. And now we
Yeah.
have gone out of the tunnel to something so bright and wonderful with infinite creative potential.
Yeah. I do feel like once we're past the quote unquote enlightenment, I have a feeling we're going to look back on the enlightenment as not being so enlightened. I think, we might come up with a new name for it where we call it something else,
Darkening.
the second dark age or something. I don't know. But yeah, I do see, I'm hopeful that we can kind of get past some of the troubles that we're in. I think there's always, every age has its challenges, and we certainly are no exception to that. But I like your idea that the return isn't necessarily going to be something that's some new giant institution that we're going to return to. That it is probably going to involve a lot more smaller intentional communities in more regional areas, and kind of moving our mindset away from uh, thinking about everything in very global and bigger terms, and kind of maybe turning more towards our local life or local communities. It seems like that is something that has eroded a lot over the past 70 years or so.
Well, if we are being more grounded in realism and historical realism, seeing how different civilizations, where they were going through the phase of their fall, what happened, we can make a prediction that it is historically informed, that most likely the vast majority of people are going to get worse in their behavior, in their intelligence, in their spiritual understanding. Yet, at the same time that this is going to happen concurrently, there's going to be small hubs of exceptional individuals. And those exceptional individuals, I believe, and this comes from my own personal experience, are going to have an inner sense of destiny. And that destiny doesn't have to justify itself in dialectical reasoning, or we should not reify it as being somehow objectively true, yet there needs to be there that sense that what we're doing is of great significance. It's bigger than us, it's bigger than I can conceive, and I feel it not only abstractly, not only through logic, but in my body, flowing through my veins. So those individuals who get connected with this pulse of the sense of inner destiny, that see something is coming, but we can't really see exactly what it is, but nonetheless they ride this wave, I do believe they're gonna be those leading personalities of those said communities.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, no, I absolutely agree. I think we're moving more and more towards that. We're starting to see some of those kind of people emerge in the world, and I can see it being more that. And like you said, maybe not all gathering around one central figure like we've seen in the past in certain ways, but something that's a little more distributed, where there's a little more variety to it, perhaps.
Yeah, something which is unified but at the same time non-centralized.
Mhm. Yeah, well, and that really gets to what you're saying about the sort of perennialism of all of this. Is like Maybe what it is we're just returning back to this idea of a perennial route to spirituality that doesn't necessarily require a, central authority to administer dogma or doctrine to
Mhm.
everybody or anything like that. But if you have a sort of network of people who are dialed in to this perennial truth and able to, lead communities at a more local level, I can definitely see that being a big changing force in just the way that we organize and the way that we think about spirituality in our life and even come to our communities and our nations and our politics and all of that.
Well, I wouldn't be connected with Buddhism or even Platonism if I was purely a rationalist. Like
Hmm.
I ended up being intimately involved in the Platonic and Buddhist praxis through a series of events which were out of the ordinary, through dream sequences, through visions, through certain synchronicities that kinda gave signs of where it would be beneficial for me to go in order for me to integrate the various disfragmented parts of myself and my experience. And this connects with what I said also earlier about reconnecting with the religion of the heart instead of the religion of the brain, of rationality. And you can even see certain individuals who are reactionary to that. The way they choose their new religion is through a series of rational argumentation in their mind. Okay, that let's say Christianity is true because this and that, or I will become Buddhist because of this and that reason. That's for me is a wrong way to have an authentic reconnection with religiosity. You already
Hmm.
begin falsely. You begin with not dissolving your fabricated sense of identity. So in theurgy, you begin with udenia, with self-emptying. If you don't experience that self-emptying, then what you choose is going to feel inauthentic in the long run. Whereas if you do experience that self-emptying, then it is the religion that chooses you, not you, the religion. I
Hmm.
think it's very wrong to say that I, in the mundane sense, chose to be involved within Platonism and Buddhism, or even be involved in the synthesis of Hellenism and the Hellenic world as it was expressed through the Platonic tradition with Buddhism. What happened was rather ruptures, where what I thought to be true about myself turned out to not to be true, and then there were signs. Specifically, I remember a little while back before I got initiated into Vajrayana, in my first initiatic transmission of Vajrayana Buddhism, I had this dream while I was traveling in Rome, and that was during COVID times. And in that dream, which was completely lucid, I was as lucid within the dream as I am right now speaking to you. There was this appearance within a luminous sky of the form of Zeus, saying to me, opportunity of death. Just these words.
Hmm.
And I knew while I was experiencing the dream that this had a very positive connotation. But at that time, I don't know exactly why I experienced this or what it meant. Neither did I speculate about it. So a few weeks after that, because I was searching for an initiatic lineage to connect to, I saw the opportunity to receive Vajrayana teachings in the lineage of Yamantaka, of the Gelug lineage of the Tibetan Buddhism. And Yamantaka is the Vajrayana Buddhist deity of the destroyer of death.
Hmm.
Now, at that time, I was kind of familiar with Buddhism, yet I did not feel any particular conscious desire to become Buddhist, to receive a transmission in that tradition. Yet, what moved me was where that initiation was transmitted. And that initiation was transmitted in a particular place in the UK, in Cardiff, Wales. And that knowledge hit me in my gut, in the core of my being. Why? Because Cardiff was the place where I went for holidays with my brother right after the death of my father. So in my psyche, that region was connected with the overcoming of my grief and nihilism of coming into contact with death, death within my family, death within someone whom I loved so dearly. And now there is this almost theatrical synchronization, seeing that dream that I mentioned with Zeus, saying about the opportunity of death, and the appearance of that synchronicity with the Yamataka initiation that drove me to actually partake in that initiatic transmission. What I'm getting at is, although rationality should not be abandoned by any means, we should remain philosophers at all times. When the transcendental comes knocking at your door in ways that you cannot ignore, and that is deeply personal. Perhaps somebody hearing my story would think that, okay, if the same thing happened to me, it would not make much sense, it would not really move me. But that's the thing. The transcendental, when it comes knocking at your door, it does so in ways which you cannot simply ignore, and it is deeply unique and personalized to your own psyche. And when it happens, it is unwise to turn your back into it. And that's the gateway for true religiosity. The self-emptying, connecting with the heart, and becoming a receptacle of that which is just beyond you, beyond yourself.
Yeah, I think, especially as Platonists, we have to remember that discursive reason is not the end all be all. Like ultimately that discursive reason is supposed to be leading us up to the nous, to a more noetic understanding of knowledge. It's not the end all be all. And ultimately that discursive reason is attempting to explain that transcendent reality. It's not, it doesn't define it necessarily. It's what we use to try to make sense of it or describe it. But it is that experience that you're talking about, that experience of the transcendent, that's really the source of the fodder, so to speak, of our thoughts in the first place, our rational thoughts. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't see them as opposed. Like you said, I don't think we should ever abandon rationality, but at the same time, we shouldn't stop at rationality either and think that just because we've been very rational and I have, like you said, it's like I have these very good ideas about what the one is and what the gods are and all of this. Like just because you have very good ideas about that they may be very rational, that doesn't mean that
Doesn't
you're
mean
engaging.
anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It's like the contrast between Iamblichus and Porphyry. Porphyry was
Mhm.
more of a rationalist, although he did engage with some practice as well. But Iamblichus criticized him on that
Mhm.
your engagement through rational inquiry with the gods does not mean anything when it comes to divine knowledge, which this is synonymous with true knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even, you get even that in Plotinus too, of he's very careful to not let it become over rational what he's doing. He's always pointing towards that transcendent, pointing towards the beyond. And, like we said before, it's one of those things that I think if you've had some of those experiences, you pick up on it and you start to realize like, oh, we're not just talking about theories. We're not talking about, charts and graphs about theology. Like there's an experience at the core of this. And I think that is that heart you're talking about. Like we have to get back to that. And I worry about that for the Platonic community. That's the one thing that I want to try to influence as best as I can, is to not let ourselves get lost in this rationalism to the point where we lose that sort of direct contact. The fact we forget the fact that like this is a spiritual tradition. This is about that transcendent experience at the core of it. The theory is what comes after that experience.
Yes, and if you're a Platonist who is more connected with Plotinus, getting involved with sudden schools of enlightenment like Zen, Tibetan Buddhist Dzogchen, Advaita Vedanta. They will resonate with you, and you will realize that the methods described within those traditions are actually the same methods of Plotinus. And if you are more involved as a Platonist practitioner with Proclus and the Iamblichus, then Tantra is the way, and the same resonance will happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that that's really the synergy here, and I think it's good kind of final thoughts on all of this. Is that I think I'm blessed that I came from a Buddhist background. Before I ever knew anything about Platonism, I was practicing Buddhism for over a decade, and we definitely lacked the ontology or the understanding of what was maybe going on from a theory standpoint. But again, I think it didn't matter. I'm glad, I'm grateful that I got that experience first. And then when I came to Platonism, it was more, oh, I can have some terminology to understand these different experiences I've had over the years. And I think for people who are looking for that and trying to connect to that more, understanding Platonism from the heart, so to speak, I think going and finding some teachers and engaging in the Buddhist tradition or the Shaiva traditions can be very, very fruitful for them.
It is the way to go towards a genuine revivalism. And this is perhaps a bold statement to make, but for me, at least, it is pretty obvious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just
Well,
one
it
last
seems
thing
like it's
I want
happening.
to add, excuse me, I want to add one last
Go
thing when
ahead.
it comes to the personalized revelation of the transcendental in the heart of a practitioner or individual. Because again, someone might counter argue, and what's the difference with the New Age
Mm-hmm.
experiences that we just criticized about an hour ago? So when that which is genuine divine is revealed to you, there are some signs that you can pick up to discern, which your discernment might not be successful all the time, but there are some signals that are useful to pick up on, and they can be trusted to a certain degree. First and foremost, the divine never is loud. It will never come in appearance to you like a show. That's one thing to take into account. Think of the Amblichian example where the ghost pretending to be Apollo came with flash and show, and the inexperienced individuals were so much amazed by that. But the divine never comes into appearance, into perception in such shows. The other thing is that after that appearance, the individual psyche feels more ordered, more integrated, more lucid. It's like before that appearance, you were seeing a dream that is not entirely lucid. The kind of dreams that you wake up and you're thinking, oh, what did I really see? I can't really remember. Or, oh, that thing that happened during my dream was really strange. It's very unrealistic. No, it's like you are having obscure dream, and then all of a sudden everything is lucid. Everything
Mm-hmm.
just becomes more intelligible, makes sense in a hyper rational level. That's different from non-conceptual that Buddhists talk about. It's hyper conceptual. You're still engaging with concepts, but you are also having a direct contact with something which is intelligibility in itself. I kind of find better words to describe it. So
Mm-hmm.
you feel more ordered, you feel more lucid, you feel more harmonious, not only within your self-talk, thinking, oh, I'm more harmonious, but in very apparent and mundane ways with your relationships, with your fellow family members, your friends, your engagement with the world. So if you're having such an experience and afterwards you're thinking, I'm enlightened, I'm awakened, I've had this contact with a divine angel, and this sharing of experience does not bring harmony in your interpersonal relationships, that's a big sign that probably you have not been contacted with something truly transcendental. It's a daemon, most likely.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think people are making that mistake all the time, and that's probably the biggest miss with a lot of new age practitioners is I think it's like they don't have maybe the understanding of how to parse out the difference between the fantasies, the daimonic, and something that's truly divine. And those are probably happening within that community, but I think they do maybe a poor job of, I don't want to say policing, but helping people to understand where their experiences are maybe not as legitimate as they think they are, and having that there's much more of a permissive, like anything goes. Oh, you had that experience, then it must be true, and that can be very dangerous, and it really leads back to the importance of having some better teachers, because one of the things in the Buddhist tradition they would always tell us is, you're going to have these experiences when you're meditating. You're going to have these really intense, you may have visions, you may have these other things, but you shouldn't necessarily focus on all of them, and they may not mean what you think they mean. So like focus back on the practice and don't get too lost in the weeds with that stuff. And I've carried that with me for a long time, and it's always kind of led me in the right direction to not get too enamored with what you might see. But just the same, there are valid, theurgic images that you may be given, but I like the caution you have with that. That's good.
I'm glad to hear it.
Well, yeah. Well, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, they can find me on Substack, Logos and Dharma, or in Telegram and YouTube.
Gotcha. And you're just starting the YouTube channel now. It's kind of
Yeah,
newer.
I just uploaded one video, an introductory video on the whole project of Logos and Dharma.
Great. Great. Good. Well, yeah, everybody, if you haven't, go subscribe. That'd be good. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the conversation. It's great talking to you, and hopefully we can have more conversations in the future. I think we're both rowing in the same direction when it comes to Platonism and community and spirituality, and hope we can work on some things in the future together.
Thank you very much for having the patience to listen to my rants.
That was very enjoyable. Thank you. All right. Well, have a good one. Thanks.